Unexplained.
Unusual.
Unstable.
Unseen.
Unlucky.
Unnatural.
Unsolved.
Unidentifiable.
Unbelievable.
Unknown. Welcome back, everybody, to the Unknown Podcast. My name is Luis.
My name is Naomi.
And today we're actually going to be exploring a very fascinating case called the Philadelphia Experiment.
And this is actually part 3 of this month's theme, which is parallel universes and time travel occurrences.
Yes, exactly. And honestly, this is one of my personal favorites. There's actually a feature film that was done in the 80s, 70s or 80s regarding this topic, and it's actually pretty fascinating how that's where I actually saw it initially. It was one of those straight-to-video movies, and
Direct to VHS.
Yeah, exactly. And it really caught my attention because I love all that stuff from the beginning, from a very young age. And I was like, oh, let me look into this further. And that's what we're going to be bringing to you today, our research and a little bit more details into it.
So I actually had never heard about this case before, so I got to look it up with a fresh set of eyes, I think. So starting from the beginning, on October 28th, 1943, a classified experiment was taking place at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Pennsylvania. A U.S. Navy destroyer escort called the USS Eldridge was claimed to have been rendered invisible to enemy devices. And you know what I actually really love about this as a side note is the fact that it was very much like a Klingon warbird, how it would go into cloak mode is kind of how this radiates. So
the origins of the story: in 1955, 12 years after the experiment occurred, a series of letters from an unknown source were sent to Morris K. Jessup, a writer and astronomer. At this time, Jessup had just published a book called The Case of UFO, which analyzed the potential existence of UFOs and their theoretical means of propulsion. Jessup received 2 letters from a man identifying himself as Carlos Miguel Allende. He also later used the name Carl M. Allen in another letter. In these letters, Allende, or Allen, claims to have been a witness to a secret World War II experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The results of the experiment, according to Allende, proved that the Navy had successfully transported a ship not only to another dimension, but to time as well.
it should be noted at this point that when Jessup initially received the letters, he dismissed Allende's claims as those of a madman. 2 years later, in 1957, the Office of Naval Research, otherwise known as ONR, in Washington, D.C., received a parcel containing a paperback copy of Jessup's book. It arrived in a manila envelope labeled Happy Easter. The book was extensively marked up in the margins with 3 different shades of pink ink. The notes covered an alleged correspondence between 3 individuals, although only one was ever identified by name, Jemmy. The ONR claimed the other 2 individuals mentioned in notes were Mr. A and Mr. B. That was their own way of separating it out. So and Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jemmy.
I wonder if Jemmy is an acronym for something. That makes you wonder, because usually it's 4-letter acronyms.
This part was a little bit sketched because you saw there were a bunch of different websites and research on it, but it seemed to be the most consistent between them, the names in there. But you never know because it's the internet and you can put anything out there. So you want to keep going?
Yes. Throughout the notes, the people referenced throughout the notes, they were discussed gypsies and detailed 2 different types of people who lived in outer space. The ONR noted that the text was written using non-standard punctuation and capitalization throughout.
So just really quick, that kind of meant that there were random periods and different things. Like it wasn't they wasn't really grammatically correct, and they had weird capitalizations, which leads to that whole, is it a code? Was it written to do another message? So just wanted to throw that out, that's what that's referring to.
Which was commonly used back in World War II and before, honestly, as kind of a way of coding through something that was published and, notifying certain people of actions and everything. The most interesting notes to the ONR, however, were the ones referencing the work of Morris Jessup and his theories regarding space travel and alien life. The notes also reference the alleged Philadelphia experiment. Jessup, as well as several handwriting experts, have compared the annotations in the book to the letters he received 2 years earlier, concluding the mysterious letters and package were written by the same man, only known as Carl Miguel Allende, and slight variances between the different shades of ink are caused by the usual different pens. The ONR actually funded a small printing of the book, including the annotations. This was known as the Vero edition, and only 100 copies were printed.
Jessup tried to continue his research and publishing more books on the subject, but was unsuccessful. A series of downturns led him down the path to suicide in Florida in April 1959. What I find really interesting, though, is the fact that he kept the letters. He thought that this guy was crazy, but he kept those letters for 2 years. I find that particularly interesting about this case.
I also think that a lot of cases like this, it's a lot of word of mouth, because obviously you don't know exactly what happened. So you have an understanding that there is going to be some exaggeration. But the fact is that this case, there's multiple people that came out, and multiple people had the exact same story before any publications were made. So this was something that people that had no contact with each other were saying the same exact thing, witnessing the same exact thing. And that's where you really want to understand that UFOs and such, you have to take it with a grain of salt. A lot of these theories that we're going to be going over and stuff, you have to take that with a grain of salt. Always. And you have to be able to pull in that information, read between the lines, and honestly make a proper determination based on the evidence.
Right.
And obviously some situations like this where there are multiple people saying the same exact thing, and the fact that the government does say that there was the Eldridge, the USS Eldridge was in Philadelphia at the time mentioned.
Okay then. So what allegedly happened during the experiment?
There are several different and contradictory versions of this story presented throughout the years. The following overviews the most common key points throughout each version. The experiment allegedly was based on a unified field theory, a term first coined by Albert Einstein. This theory, in a nutshell, was trying to describe the interrelated nature of the forces of electromagnetism and gravity. In other words, uniting their respective fields into a single field. And that's why it's called the unified field theory. And also exactly what we had brought up in the previous episodes, the magnetism of the Earth and how it could cause these different variations. How does this relate to the experiment conducted by the Navy? The theory is that a group of researchers believed that there was a version of the field described by Einstein that could be used to bend light around an object that would then make it completely invisible to the naked eye. For any sci-fi fans out there, this is like a cloaking device. The Navy saw the tactical advantages this could provide and allegedly sponsored the experiment for this reason.
And you gotta think, this is during heavy war periods, and they were relying very heavily on the ships during that time. So it was stealth technology at its finest, if they could have made it work.
Ahead of time.
Yes.
And also at that point, we were losing the war. The process was going down, and it was very, very much a very ominous point. So at this point, they just threw everything against the wall and see what stuck.
Yep.
In another account of the story, the researchers were hoping to use magnetic and gravitational properties to detect anomalies on the seafloor, supposedly to better understand Einstein's theory regarding gravity. In this account, Nazi Germany also wanted to find anti-gravity, which there is another case known as the Bell. And that is the theory where the German scientists actually said that they tested out this bell-shaped object that was able to manipulate time and space around itself. And there is a theory where it actually landed right about 10 miles away from Philadelphia from this experiment about a year later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no one source that can confirm how the experiment was conducted, but in most versions, the USS Eldridge was fitted with the required equipment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. This was done in the summer of 1943. Supposedly, it was actually successful to a limited extent. According to accounts, one test resulted in the ship being nearly invisible, with some witnesses reporting a greenish fog in its place. The crew on board the ship reported severe nausea after the experiment was concluded. There was also rumors that upon reappearing, the sailors on board the ship experienced reappearing in different places, and one crew member actually claimed that his hand had ended up embedded in the hull of the ship. There were also claims of insanity among the crew on board, but none of these claims have been independently substantiated. But what's really cool about this is they do reference it again in Star Trek about the issues with teleportation. When you kind of break things apart and mess around with gravity in different fields and you bring it back together again, it can be in the wrong place.
Exactly.
So that's pretty cool that actually came up in this pre all those sci-fi theories.
Exactly.
Even though sci-fi existed back then, but the fact that they're similar across the board.
Very much like if you've ever seen The Fly, it's very similar to what he actually experienced in that a little fly flies into the molecular thing that was being teleported, and it changed his DNA completely.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, though, later that same year, they repeated the experiment, supposedly.
Yes.
And that was in October 1943. And in this version, the Eldridge was not only invisible, but transported to Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. And there are claims that the men aboard the SS Andrew Forsyth?
Yes.
Were able to see the ship before the Eldridge disappeared and reappeared back in Philadelphia. And there was a claim that it had occurred over the space of 10 minutes.
And that's the other thing, is that this ship, when they actually tracked the trajectory of the ship, it was actually previously in Norfolk, Virginia, about a week before. Yeah. So it was actually harbored there a week before. Mm-hmm. And that's where kind of the discrepancies play a huge part, is that theories are, oh yeah, no, they saw it the week before and people just thought of the wrong date.
Well, the problem with these is there's a lot of fallacy with human memory, and it's easy to be led to give an answer saying, yes, I did see it, but if you question yourself for a minute, you're gonna be like, did I see it then, or was it later, but it's the Navy, so you'd hope they'd be a little bit more accurate about it. But again, human memory sucks sometimes, and since this was so under wraps,
exactly, again, there are also reports of serious side effects from the crew. There are rumors again of sailors reappearing fused to the bulkheads, while others suffered severe mental disorders. Some even claim that men disappeared completely. Conspiracy theorists claim that the ship's crew might have been subjected to brainwashing after this occurred to ensure secrecy of these events would be guaranteed. And that's kind of the cop-out kind of excuse that's given in all these conspiracy theories. Oh yes, they all went through manipulation, and that's why they don't testify correctly. Mm-hmm. But this one actually says that there was people that witnessed on land seeing that the people were going through the bulkhead, and even including the outside hull, people were seeing hands through the hull when it reappeared.
Right. In another story, researcher Jacques Vallée describes a procedure on the USS Engstrom, which was docked alongside the Eldridge in 1943. The operation involved the generation of a powerful electromagnetic field on board the ship in order to deperm or degauss it, with the goal of rendering the ship undetectable or invisible to magnetically fused undersea mines and torpedoes. The system was invented by a Canadian named Charles F. Goodeve when he held the rank of commander in the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve and the Royal Navy, and other navies used it widely during World War II, because that was a huge issue in World War II.
Yeah.
U-boats, all of that, it was a huge issue in maritime.
Exactly. And most of a little history lesson on that, the U-boats actually had accounted for the destruction of about half the supplies that were needed to maintain England afloat. So if you put that in perspective, you lost about 6,000 to 7,000 ships within a 2-year span of the US aid that was sent to England. And that's why they weren't able to properly basically build up their navy and army again, because they had left all their supplies on the coast of Dunkirk.
So in this story, and it's one of those, like, how do they explain what happened? British ships of the era often included such degaussing systems into the upper decks. The conduits are still visible in the HMS Belfast in London, actually, and it's still used today. However, there's no effect or visible light on the radars. So Vallée speculates that accounts of the USS Engstrom's degaussing might have garbled and confabulated, isn't that a great word? Confabulated.
It really is.
The subsequent retellings, and that these accounts may have influenced the story of the Philadelphia effect. So it was actually spillover from another ship and what was happening during that time, which messed with the sensor readings on the Eldridge, and that's why people couldn't read it. It wasn't actually the Eldridge going through it, it was a spillover from work they were doing on another ship that was right next to it.
Huh, that's interesting.
And he went on to cite that a veteran who served aboard the USS Engstrom and who suggested it might have traveled from Philadelphia to Norfolk and back again in a single day at the time when merchant ships were not in use. And it was only open to naval vessels, and it was quiet. Maybe that's what it is. They were seeing another ship that went back and forth during the day, because a lot of the time they were tag teaming efforts that were going on. Yeah. This was especially popular with the British during that time, and it was to maximize efficiency of traveling those lanes. So it's possible that they saw another ship that looked similar, or had this weird effect where they couldn't read the Eldridge for a certain amount of time, saw this other ship, and that's kind of his explanation, that it's really just two ships and a lot of confusion about what happened that day.
I could see that happening, but also at the same time, I know for a fact that the US was testing other theories and other methods of actually winning the war. That's the reason they came across the atomic bomb, was because they were testing theories to win the war immediately. So if it wasn't for situations like that, and even the Nazis were doing the same thing, and it was widely known in all major governments at the time that the Nazis were going after these kind of occult-like theories, basically, and trying to see if they could come up with correct information, and trying to come up with these new methods of winning this war that had gone on for 6 years already at this point.
But I did see a note that one of the most adamant believers that this actually occurred was a underage, like a boy who was in a bar, and he was taken away for underage drinking that day after a bar fight when he claimed all this happened. So that's one of the most reliable, quote-unquote, sources for what happened that day, and it was a drunk dude in a bar fight.
Yeah.
So, grain of salt.
Yeah, and I do think that the U.S. Navy will, unfortunately, because of the non-disclosure and stuff like that, that our government has done on previous experiments, and we find out about it years later, very much like the mind control methods and all that stuff, the MK Ultra, all that was just theories, but we found out about 20 years ago that it is actually something that was done.
Right.
So these are kind of things that you think of and you're like, holy shit, you would never expect the U.S. government to do this, but they do, and they have in the past. And that's where a lot of these theories come from. Obviously, people know things, and they're exaggerated to a certain extent. So you have to read between the lines on this. So a little bit of the aftermath that happened afterwards. The crew at the 4th Naval District have said that this is simply a misunderstanding of routine research conducted in their facility during World War II. There was a similar project going on with the destroyer, which is what Naomi was bringing up, and many theorists claim that the basis for the story comes from the account of one person who, with no corroborating evidence, basically was not able to really do anything, and has a long line of psychiatric illnesses and everything.
Well, and this, part of this comes from this whole Carlos Allende and the fact that the dude was known to be crazy, and he was one of the major proponents of this later on when he sent those letters and all of that to the Navy, that this is what happened, and he was using those theories that Jessup had created. So It's just, there's a lot of kind of random people out there that are supporting this story, but don't really have any evidence. Like, there's no evidence that Carlos was there.
Yeah.
Or had any knowledge of what happened. So I think that's one of those cases where he heard about it, and he was really into UFOs and this theory, and he thought Jessup was an outlet for it, is my thought process of it.
Okay. And then also the inconsistencies. Let's go over those. The main thing that basically the U.S. government indicates to us and disclosed to us as the public. The USS Eldridge was not commissioned until August 27, 1943, and it remained in port in New York City until September 1943. The October experiment allegedly took place while the ship was on its first shakedown cruise in the Bahamas. Although proponents of the story claim that the ship's logs might have been falsified or else still be classified. Go ahead.
The Office of Naval Research stated in September 1996, ONR has never conducted investigations on radar invisibility either in 1943 or any other time, pointing out that the ONR was not established until 1946. It denounces the accounts of the Philadelphia experiment as complete science fiction.
And the funny thing is about that is that is a false statement in itself, because obviously there was experiments in stealth technology, because we have the Nighthawk bomber and also the bombers that are stealth technology. Mm-hmm. And those didn't come out until mid to the late 90s. So those were stealth technology, so it was actually something done. So that in itself is a complete fabrication in itself, and contradicts what the ONR is already stating to the public.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where the conspiracy theorists go wild, because obviously there is inconsistencies with the story that the government's feeding us.
But a reunion of the Navy veterans who served on board the Eldridge told the Philadelphia newspaper in 1999 that their ship had never actually made port in Philadelphia. And then further evidence discounting the Philadelphia experiment comes from the USS Eldridge's complete World War II action report, including remarks on the 1943 deck log that are available on microfilm. So the reports from the actual ship are saying that this never happened. Some of the people on the ship are saying it never happened, but you get conspiracy theorists who say, okay, it did happen, but they're going to do everything they can to cover it up.
Yeah.
So, and in the bigger picture, how does this relate to the time travel and parallel universes and things like that? It's saying that basically the Navy towed its line and went in there and tried to do it, and it got messed up, and they realized it, and Jessup got kind of pulled into this whole thing just because he had happened to write a book about the theories beforehand. So they're like, does he know something? Did he understand the technology? Because he was researching UFO technology during that time, which would have been even more out in left field than it is today. Like, there's still people there, like, they don't believe that there are UFOs, they don't believe there is alien life. So a book that came out in the mid 40s, it's going to be even more unfathomable that that's really something that can happen. But basically, They're saying the Navy got a hold of alien technology and was able to transport to different dimensions, but it got jacked up because they didn't understand it.
Yeah, which I don't discount that.
Isn't that par for the course of humanity?
Yeah.
I mean, look at the nuclear bomb. You're playing with things that you shouldn't, because you don't really understand the full impact until you do it.
Yeah.
And you go, oh crap, let's reel it back a little bit.
Exactly.
So.
And there's also actually a case that happened in 2011 that actually was a successful teleportation of an inanimate object from Sydney, Australia to Tokyo, Japan. Mm-hmm. Within a matter of 5 seconds, there was an object that teleported from their teleportation device to that one.
See, I'm much more on board with the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where he was able to send chocolate from his factory to a TV and you could grab it. That's the teleportation I could get on board with. But going back to this, I think it's the environment, the time that we were in. It was rampant with paranoia. War was all over the world. No one trusted anybody, and it's easy to see where, the government might be doing experiments to try to up the ante, because the United States we didn't have a great military back then. I mean, they've referenced it a million times over that we weren't really super great and organized. So, you're talking like them trying to do anything they could to get ahead in the war.
In the 1930s also, there was an operation called Operation Paperclip 1940s, mm-hmm. and it actually brought over scientists from the Nazis. And they were able to use those Nazi scientists to be able to build and create things that we couldn't have created 10 years before. I think
especially, though, the fact that you're dealing, especially with with the U-boat situation and maritime war, which is so different than what we do today. You're not using a bunch of planes as your primary. You're transporting troops and things over that. So the Navy was really relying on that because it's the only way to get our troops over to do anything. So, I mean, they were going to do anything they could to protect the ships. And there was a lot going on during that time to do anything to dissuade what was happening, because ships were going down right and left.
Exactly.
So,
and I think that's the thing, though. The Black Ops, what do you call it, projects and stuff like that, they do not need to be disclosed if they are considered or labeled as Black Ops. Mm-hmm. And that's something that it's been already proven beyond a shadow of a doubt because of disclosure agreements that came out 50 years after, that they actually have evidence where logs and films were actually tampered with and changed due to Black Ops projects and experiments that were done.
See, but
that's not unknown.
This is getting more into conspiracy theory. What are your thoughts on the use of deliberately trying to trip between universes and time, as opposed to what we've covered before, which were accidents? They stumbled onto basically cracks in the universe.
I think what they were trying to do was create invisibility, and what they did do was actually create a fabric in time and space.
See, I think this is telling of the fact that this is very sensitive and it should not be messed with. I think that is, and it's something that comes up again in sci-fi over and over again, that they're trying to learn how to do it. You see it, and it usually doesn't end well.
Yeah.
When you intentionally try to wedge something between those, because they're not meant to be overlapped, and that's going to create problems. And I think, if you believe that this happened, if you believe they did it and they got messed up, they probably know a lot about why they shouldn't be doing this, and that's why it got abandoned as a project. Because if you notice, we don't have that. We haven't hit that level of technology yet, and you'd think after 60 plus years, if they had continued the research, we would be a little bit closer to it now.
Yeah.
But we're not.
And this is actually even research that was conducted by Nikola Tesla.
So I am a believer that they need to leave this alone. I believe they did it. I believe that they realized that they shouldn't, really hardcore, really quickly, and that's why it got abandoned. I don't doubt that they did it, because a little knowledge can be a very dangerous thing.
And what's very fascinating is that they said that the boat was in the Bahamas, which is the beginning of the Bermuda Triangle, and you wonder if there is some kind of connection in that.
Yeah, I guess you could.
And if there was a bleed over, if they're trying to test this technology on another boat, and that boat, because of the ripple effect that was caused, it suddenly brought the USS Eldridge into focus in Philadelphia when it wasn't supposed to be there, when it was in Bermuda.
And there are a lot of weird things that happen out at sea. You're talking about people who have been isolated for months at a time. Sometimes they're very much alone, and there's only certain people that have knowledge. That's a big thing about any type of U.S. government project, is that you've got varying levels of knowledge about it. And if a tiny bit comes out of context, or, leaks out when it shouldn't, that's where you get these conspiracy theories, though, where they go off. And then you get the government going, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense because of A, B, and C. But it's like, wait, but your A, B, and C don't line up with official accounts of A, B, and C. So it's hard. And you're looking at a time when record keeping was not what it is now, and there wasn't cell phones and tracking and GPS or anything like that. So it's harder to go back and retroactively confirm or deny data.
Exactly.
So anyway.
And I think a lot of it, I honestly, my understanding of what it should have been and what it could have been, I think it was an experiment gone wrong, and it created an effect that they didn't expect, which was complete teleportation to an alternate dimension. Mm-hmm. And that's why I really wanted to bring this to the table, because I think that it does fit with our pattern for this month.
Oh, I think it absolutely does. I think it goes into when you're intentionally trying to play with it rather than an accidental, which these other cases are usually that case where someone who has no idea or knowledge, and they have this experience of what goes on, as opposed to just where it's intentional manipulation of the universe and the fields in there. So it's an important topic to cover.
Exactly. And I wonder why Philadelphia, out of all places, Yeah, that's what makes me wonder. Why Philadelphia?
Steak sandwiches? Isn't that a thing in Philadelphia?
Better food.
The groundhog?
Yeah. But
the Philly cheesesteak, that's what it is.
The Philly cheesesteak. Exactly. So honestly, guys, let us know what you thought of this theory and what your theory is. What you think could actually be in this case. What happened in the Philadelphia experiment? That crazy day where it suddenly disappeared, or did it? Exactly. My name is Luis.
My name is Naomi.
And we are the Unknown Podcast. Please follow us on Facebook and all podcast channels. Thank you. Have a great day.